Here is a story about how I went from selling apples in the schoolyard to becoming one of the most infamous Mafia kingpins of New York. Episode 1. The Apple Hustle. New York, 1905. The schoolyard stank of chalk dust and wet wool. Boys in frayed caps chased each other between the cracked bricks, shouting in half a dozen languages. Italian, Yiddish, Irish, broken English stitched together like patchwork. Teachers kept to the steps, arms folded, pretending not to notice when a fight broke out. This was the Lower East Side, and if you wanted to survive here, you learned quick. I wasn't the biggest, I wasn't the fastest, but I had something else. I knew how to turn one apple into five. It started with my uncle. He worked the docks, hauling crates until his back bent like a question mark. Some nights he came home with little gifts, things that had fallen off the ships. A tin of tobacco, a handful of cigars, or, on one lucky night, a whole crate of apples. He dumped them onto our kitchen table with a grunt. "Make yourself useful, kid," he told me, lighting a stub of a cigarette. "Sell 'em before they rot." The next morning I carried a sack of them to school. The other boys laughed at me, jeering as I set them out on a broken bench. "What's this, fruit stand now?" one of them barked, freckles dancing across his nose. "Who's gonna buy from you?" I didn't answer. I just sliced one of the apples with my penknife, holding the slice up so the juice glistened in the morning sun. A younger boy, maybe 9, licked his lips. "Penny apiece," I said. He dug into his pocket, slapped a coin into my hand, and bit down on the slice like it was the finest thing he'd ever tasted. That was the first sale. By noon the sack was empty. I'd made more in one morning than my father did in a day at the docks. The trick wasn't selling, it was multiplying. Next time, I handed a few apples to the boys who hung around me. "You sell 'em, keep 2 pennies for yourself. Bring the rest to me." They grinned, happy to have something better than nothing, and by the end of the week, I had 3 boys selling under me. I didn't have to lift a finger, just supply the apples. It grew from there. One boy's father owned a bakery. I cut a deal for his stale bread, sold it cheap to kids who couldn't afford fresh. Another had a cousin who worked at a print shop. Soon we were selling doctor's notes for kids who wanted to skip class. A third was light-fingered, always slipping chalk and pencils from the teacher's closet. I bought it off him for pennies, sold it back to desperate kids for nickels. Within months, half the schoolyard was tied to me somehow. If you needed something, an eraser, a sandwich, a reason to skip class, you came to me. It wasn't long before I had to enforce order. One day, a boy named Danny tried muscling in. He was bigger than me, a dock worker's son with fists like hammers. He shoved one of my sellers against the wall, snatched his bag of apples, and started giving them away for free. Kids swarmed him like pigeons, laughing as they grabbed their share. That night, I sat on the steps of our building, thinking it over. I could fight him, but I'd lose. I could tell a teacher, but they didn't care. No, the only way was to make an example. The next day, I pulled 2 of my closest boys aside. "You see Danny?" I asked. They nodded. "He wants to play games." "Fine. You grab him after school. Rough him up a little, not too much, just enough to make him think twice." They did as I asked. Danny came limping to class the next morning, lips split, eyes swelling purple. He didn't touch my sellers again. That was the first time I realized something important. Money's good, but loyalty is better. The boys who worked for me didn't just see me as a boss, they saw me as protection. As long as they were under my wing, no one would touch them. The teachers noticed the change, though they never understood it. Our class was the quietest, the most orderly. They chalked it up to luck, maybe to discipline, but really it was because I'd turned the class into a business, a well-oiled machine. By 14, I wasn't just hustling apples anymore. I was lending money to kids who came up short on lunch, charging interest they didn't notice. I was arranging protection for weaker boys, making sure bullies found themselves outnumbered. I was, without knowing the word, building an organization. I didn't call it crime. To me, it was business. Just numbers and deals, favors traded for favors. But deep down, I think I knew. Because when I looked around the schoolyard, at the boys slipping me coins, at the ones who nodded in respect when I walked past, I saw something no other kid had: power. And it all started with a single apple. Episode 2, The First Crew. By the time I turned 14, school was more a side note than an education. The real lessons were learned outside those walls, in the streets that smelled of horse manure, coal smoke, and fried onions from the pushcarts. The Lower East Side was alive with noise. Immigrants shouting in their mother tongues, ragged newsboys hollering headlines, trolley bells clanging down crowded avenues. I worked mornings and evenings at a cigar shop on Delancey, sweeping floors, emptying spittoons, and fetching cigars for men with money in their coats. The pay was pennies, but it gave me something more important: connections. The owner, Mr. Weiss, was a gruff German who didn't care if I listened when his customers talked. And oh, did they talk? Politics, unions, rumors about strikes at the docks, whispers of liquor shipments moving through the riverfront. Most of it I didn't understand at first, but I listened anyway. Every name, every route, every complaint went into my head like coins into a bank. Then came the day that changed everything. A man in a fine hat leaned across the counter, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "Kid," he said, "you think you can get me something stronger than cigars?" I frowned. "Like what, sir?" He slid a dollar bill across the counter, more than I made in a week. "Gin." I knew a dockhand who sold bottles cheap, liquor that came in from Canada, hidden under crates of lumber. That night I bought one and slipped it into a paper bag. The man picked it up the next morning, winked, and walked out, easy as breathing. I thought it was a one-time thing, until he returned with 2 friends the following week. Then a week later, 5 more men. Before long, I wasn't just sweeping cigar ash, I was supplying liquor to half the regulars. And I wasn't alone. The boys from school hadn't scattered after graduation. They were working, sweating in factories, hauling at the docks, selling papers on corners. But when they saw me handing out dollars instead of nickels, their eyes lit up. "Boss," said Tommy, tall, wiry, with hands always twitching like he couldn't sit still, "you need someone to make deliveries. I can run bottles all night." "Boss," said Joey, the heavy one with fists like stones, "you need muscle. Nobody'll touch your goods if I'm there." I hadn't realized it until then, but I had my first crew. The same boys who sold apples for me in the yard now carried crates of gin through back alleys. They trusted me because I'd fed them when they were hungry kids. And in return, I gave them something more than wages. I gave them belonging. One night, I gathered them in the back of the cigar shop, a single oil lamp flickering against the walls. "We're not kids anymore," I told them. "This isn't apples or chalk. This is serious business. The men we're dealing with, they won't hesitate to break bones or worse. But if we stick together, no one can touch us. You make money, I make money, and everyone eats." They nodded, eyes hard, jaws set. Even Joey, who usually cracked jokes, was silent. That was the moment I stopped being just a hustler. I became a leader. It wasn't long before the shop couldn't hold us anymore. I rented a tiny room above a butcher's on Hester Street. The stink of blood and sawdust drifted through the floorboards, but it was private. That room became our headquarters. We kept ledgers there, bottles stacked in crates, envelopes of money tucked into drawers. The operation grew. We weren't just selling liquor to cigar men anymore. We had a route, speakeasies tucked behind barbershops and bakeries, passwords whispered through half-open doors, jazz spilling out into the alleys, glasses clinking behind curtains. And with growth came enemies. One evening, Tommy burst into the room, face pale. "They hit the truck," he gasped. "Out by Canal. Smashed every bottle." I felt my blood go cold. We'd just lost a week's profit. "Who?" I asked. "Danny's boys," Tommy said. I remembered Danny, the bully from the schoolyard, now grown, running his own crew of roughnecks. He hadn't forgotten the beating my boys gave him years ago. Now he was back for revenge, and this time it wasn't about apples. That night, I walked the alleys alone, cigarette glowing in the dark. I thought about quitting, about going back to sweeping floors and living safe. But then I remembered the faces of my crew, the coins in their pockets, the food on their tables, all of it because of me. No, I couldn't quit, not now. That was the night I realized something simple and terrifying. Once you start building an empire, you don't get to step away. The world won't let you. And so, with a steady hand and a cold heart, I gave my first real order. "Danny's boys want a war," I said to Joey the next morning. "Then we'll give 'em one."